So, welcome back. I thank the first panelists, and I think we'll now be ready for our keynote. So, I am very pleased to introduce the Senior Vice President and Chief Data Scientist for Dun & Bradstreet. So, Dr. Anthony Scriffignano has been in the business of IT and management consulting for over 35 years. I met Anthony probably 10 years ago now at the first Wolfram Data Summit. And as an information scientist, then a doctoral student in information science, and moving into the data world, I was tremendously excited about the work that was happening at Dun & Bradstreet that Anthony was leading. He's a leader in international business and leads D&B's discovery, curation, and synthesis of information. He and his team work on information and data problems in multiple languages, geographies, and contexts across the globe. His extensive background in linguistics and advanced algorithms and holds multiple patents relating to identity and related processes. And he's an international expert and thought leader on data and data stewardship, organizational change management, and operations.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. So I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk, and I will apologize in advance. Normally I like to stroll around, but we have a détente here that I've agreed to sort of stay between about here and about there. I'm going to do my best. I'm probably going to walk out of the frame. Sorry. It's a messy world. And before I get started, because I have a group of really smart people here, and I have a group of people who understand IRB and informed consent and research, I'd like to ask you all to help me participate in an experiment that I've been doing all over the world. So in order to participate in this, I have to explain the benefit that will come to you. The benefit that will come to you is that I will be happy. So I am going to put my hand up like this. And when I do that, I'd like to ask everyone in the room to clap one single time. Just once, exactly one single clap. Does everyone understand? Are you willing to participate? Thank you. There's always an overachiever that goes first. Okay. All right, that was the training round. Now we're going to do the actual experiment. Once again, I'm going to put my hand up one time. Please clap exactly once. Okay, now this is the last round. For this round, I'm going to change the ask. I'd like to ask you to clap instead of one time, please clap 3 times. Instead of one time, please clap 3 times. What did you notice? It sounds almost simultaneous. And I'll tell you from standing up here, that is among the best. I've done this, I can't tell you how many times I've done. So well done, right? Give yourselves a hand. Right? Now, a couple things there. And the reason I point this out, everyone here lives in a world of ridiculously huge data sets and really fast computers and sort of truth, right? Ground truth. What is ground truth when human beings are involved? How did we know how fast to clap? I was very careful. I didn't say, please clap exactly 3 times, because that would have given you a hint of cadence. I didn't look at anybody. I actually said it backwards. I said, instead of 1 time, please clap 3 times. I did everything I could to remove cadence from my instruction, and yet the clapping was almost simultaneous. Now, even more interesting is if you watch the video, it's not nearly as simultaneous as you remember it. Your brain sort of organizes the world around you. And I know we have neuroscientists in the room, so I'm going to mess this up, right? Okay. But, I started in nuclear physics, so, sorry. But the way that we organize information is modeled. We have neuromorphic computing, we have neural networks, we have all kinds of fancy ways of describing heuristics, algorithms that behave the way we think our brain works, but the reality is we don't really know. I need a willing volunteer. You seem really nice. Could you just please name 5 red things for me? A hat, a car, shoes, socks, and a piece of paper. So you were sort of on this clothing run for a little while with the hat, shoes, and socks, but the car and the piece of paper, some people say lipstick, a clown's nose, a stop sign, right? You would agree that those fit in the set. What you're doing right now is writing a program in your brain that you don't understand, and you're testing the veracity of the output before you say it in real time. We don't know what we're doing, right? We're born with this amazing neural network in our head. Nobody in this room right now is thinking about how their shoes feel. Now you're all thinking about how your shoes feel. Some of you are trying not to think about how your shoes feel, right? What are we doing? We're discovering data all the time. So I want to try to bring you, if I can, away from the world where data is conveniently organized in a hub to the world where data is being created sort of while we breathe in and breathe out. And that's somewhat of the reality of the world I live in. I have a very short video. Please no eye rolling. Anybody who's got the video, everybody says, oh, here we go. This video exemplifies this world that we live in where everything is conveniently organized. So while you watch this commercial from the fine folks at Adobe, I have no commercial stake in that, got this off YouTube, I would like to ask you to just think about how the data landscape is changing in your world, not the world where you're connected to a hub of data, the rest of your world. And also, what are we doing in data science to respond? Some phenomenal discussion this morning around like, what are we learning and how are we capturing those learnings going forward? You know, lessons learned are only lessons learned if we learn from them, right? So what are we learning? And then what type of skills do we need in this crazy world where everything is connected and where decisions happen, mistakes, we can make mistakes so fast right now. So very short video.
Peter, come take a look at this.
Mr. Daniels. Look at this.
What's this? The numbers, they keep getting bigger and bigger.
The clicks are off the charts.
Yeah.
Yoshi, it's Walter. We're back.
Yes, sir. Molto tracking. More shifting, more shifting. I need more trees. More trees? I'll get you more trees.
Hey, take a look at wood pulp.
Well, everything you got on wood pulp right now.
He really loves that thing.
Now that would be funny if it wasn't so sadly close to true. The reality is that we really need to stop and seriously think about the implications that we make, the trivial implications sometimes in the business world, not necessarily in the empirical scientific community, but definitely in the business world. My favorite guy there is, more trees, I'll get you more trees. You know, and I like the moto trucking guy. All of these things are connected, right? The Internet of Things that we all hear so much about, and there's usually some distant waving of the hand when we talk about the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things today is not an Internet of Things. It's an Internet of Things connected to the Internet, right? Those things all have applications behind them. But then somebody this morning was talking about drones. Well, they're not connected to anything. So what happens when we start developing autonomous devices that can collect information and maybe share it with other autonomous devices that they discover? I think we probably ought to think about the security implications of that. I think maybe we ought to think about the inference that we get from a buy signal, right? When I published my dissertation, I guess I created a signal. I started to get all kinds of email for online universities, right? I think the algorithm was wrong, or maybe they were trying to suggest they didn't like my research. I don't know. But, you know, I think that there's a lot of stupid stuff going on, and if we tell the truth, we live with this every single day. You all have devices that don't quite work right. You all have systems that don't quite connect right. We all collect data that we can't quite share, right? So it's really not the world, you know, it's like the world of George Jetson, right? For those of you that are old enough to remember George Jetson, I'm looking around the room, not too many of you. But anyway, you know, it's like this future world where everything is automated and nothing quite works right? That's a little bit closer to where we are. At my company, Dun & Bradstreet, we have the world's largest commercial database of its type. It's a global database of business entities. It's all the firmographic and demographic information. It's how the companies are related, their corporate family trees, all kinds of dynamic data around trade and suits and liens and judgments, and it's not all public information. It's mostly not. Most companies in the world are private. They're private for a reason. They don't have to tell anybody anything, so we have to figure out a lot of this. These are some credit reports. We go back 176 years, so before the Civil War. And at that time, there was westward expansion, right? And companies were doing business with other companies, and they needed to know about them, and they couldn't get on a horse and go there because they might die. So we did it for them. And here's some credit reports. And look at the words in red. It is said, right? Purchaser of stolen goods, I think, and my personal favorite, about to marry a fellow of no account, right? We would never put anything like this in a credit report today. Or would we? We might have a score that on a scale of 1 to 10 says 7 or 8. Doesn't that mean I think? And we have, I just said, suits, liens, judgments. Well, judgments, purchaser of stolen goods, kind of feels like there's court action there, right? About to marry a person of no account. I don't know if we would put that in a report today. I certainly hope not. But we have something called global beneficial ownership, where you understand who the ultimate beneficiary is of an organization, which may not be an equity related. Whoops. Doesn't feel like a whole lot of this has changed. The difference is that these things were being done one at a time, and they were narrative reports, and they were very careful. Abraham Lincoln worked for Dun & Bradstreet. So did other U.S. presidents, like before they were president. Not necessarily sure whether that's an endorsement in the modern context for some of you, and that's not about the current administration. I'm just saying that, we don't think of the president the way they did then, right? What does this all mean? How is this all changing? How are the questions that our customers are coming to us with, or your students are coming to you with, or your advisors are coming to you with, how are those questions changing? How are we upping our game? It used to be that all empirical research started with observing the environment and then asking some kind of important guiding question, refining that question, doing a literature review to understand what others have done before you, picking a method, defending it as the best method, executing the method, collecting the data, analyzing the data. Did I get that about right? For all that? Yeah, okay. But today, a lot of it is, we got this cool open source tool that does machine learning. Let me point it at this data and see what it learns. And often we forget the step where we say, how do we know this is the right data? Or how do we know that a machine learning regressive approach that assumes that the future will be reasonably close to the past in terms of some error distribution is a relevant method in the event of something like Brexit, or nuclear missiles being launched in North Korea, or any of these disturbing and disruptive things that happen, or maybe not so disturbing, advances in medical science. So I think sometimes, as a data scientist, I find that we're missing that step of sort of the careful bricolage of the question of what are we asking, and are we sure that's the right question? Somebody comes to me with a data set and says, can you tell me what you can see in this data? I usually say something cocky like, what would you like me to see? Because in any sufficiently large set of data, I'll find anything you want, right? And if I go in with these a priori conclusions, I'll probably find them, because we have so much data now. We're swimming in data. We have actually lost the ability to measure, arguably, lost the ability to measure the rate at which the amount of information on Earth is increasing. Not only don't we know how much information there is, we kind of lost that second derivative. That's terrifying. That is terrifying. Someone here said, and I'm going to misquote you, but it was a great quote when you said it, even computer science doesn't really have the tools to deal with some of this data. Amen, brother, right? Or sister, I don't remember who said it. That's absolutely true. So I think part of this is just sort of about asking whether the information we use is the right information to make the decisions we're trying to make. And another one that's really alarming is, could we fully understand the answer before the environment changes so much that the analysis doesn't make any sense anymore? A lot of the technological advances that we have are advancing the speed with which we hit the wall. And I'm just speaking the truth here. If you want to disagree with me, I'd love to hear it, but say it fast, because things change. So just because I love this picture, I want to talk about change a little bit, which isn't really about data, but I would argue that if you're in the business of data right now, you're in the business of change. Now, if you're in the business of data that is, truly positivistic, here are the physical properties of granite, maybe not so much. Maybe we learn a little bit more about granite, but it's kind of, I hate to say it, cut in stone, right? Come on, that was funny. Granite, okay. All right, got to work with me. But change in the environment of data right now is everywhere, and change begets change. So a lot of times what happens is we'll discover a way of collecting information. There was a brilliant analysis done a couple of years ago now. There was an earthquake, a small earthquake in California, small enough that you could sleep through it. And it was at between 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning. And a group of scientists was able to get the data from, I don't know which fitness monitor it was, but they were able to get the data, anonymized, and then they wanted to study like who woke up and who didn't wake up, and did people go back to sleep, or did they stay up in the presence of this small earthquake, with this very noble mission of, we want to understand preparedness for the big earthquake, right? I have a lot of problems with that, because I'm not sure I volunteered to let anybody know what time I go to bed and wake up. I don't even tell my family members that sometimes, right? Because I'm up at ridiculous hours reading emails and doing things when I should be sleeping, right? Does anybody want to openly well, actually, I would suspect that if I actually asked that question, there'd be a histogram, and the younger you are, the more you don't care, right? But, it's at least problematic, right? So everybody's got a device. I read a study this morning about a study that someone is proposing to do on Parkinson's by using the sensor data from watches. Well, hold on. I don't believe that I was informed, and because I clicked I agree to install the app is not enough. I'm sorry. So change begets change. Not all of it is good, and yet we all know that change is survival. I mentioned to you that my company is 176 years old. I'm not talking about my company, but I'm using it as a point of reference. There's about 27 million businesses in the United States. There are 11 that are that old, and we've looked at them. We wish there were 10. But anyway, I'm not wishing that on any one of the other 10. The ones that have survived are all businesses that have changed what they do dramatically over the years. What they do, maybe their fundamental mission is similar, but they've changed, and they've changed again. There's mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, changes in the business model, et cetera. And it turns out that change is survival. It also turns out that change is messy, and change produces a lot of detritus along the way. So, good luck with any one of these very large data sets if you want to change the way you cleanse that data. I'm sure we've all been in that particular circle of hell. Like, you realize that you created a set of data and that you could have created it better with a new analytic method that perhaps is more sensitive to something you weren't aware of when you created it. Well, now do you go back and change all the data? And what about all the analysis that was done on all that data? And what about all the data that was produced from that analysis? It becomes almost impossible. And we can't just say, well, now we're going to hit stop and all the new data, because then we can't compare anything to the past. So that's a big problem. The only people who really like change all the time are wet babies. If we tell the truth, people say, I love change, I'm an agent of change, I drive change in the organization. They usually say it with some sort of officious tone like that. But those same people will say, but don't move my desk, right? And please, if you give me a new computer, make sure all the old applications still run on it. And, there's this sort of approach avoidance behavior around change. And I think that's healthy, because sometimes change isn't as good as we all like to worship it for. So I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about the way I see data, and I'm talking about the messy side of data now, not the clean, organized, structured side of data. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we believe and try to challenge that a little bit. And then I'm going to talk about this phrase, data abounds, data confounds. A little bit of inconvenient truths and common myths around big data from where I sit, from what I see. And then I want to talk a little bit about the future and some of the things that I've included in briefings for White House committees and governments around the world and so forth. So I figured, why not share them with you as well? So that's what I'm going to do. So first I start with that scientific model. I'm going to observe the universe or the world the way I see it from data. So, not too long ago, I understood how data was created and stored. Data was created in places like newsrooms. Data was created in places like laboratories, right? And it was stored on servers and on hard drives and in databases. And what I'm looking at here is a picture from that time frame. And what you have is a bunch of people reading about things that were in the past and maybe listening to people that are not in the present. I get that. I understand how information is being created and consumed in that paradigm. Today, we have color, right? You could initially say, well, other than having electronic devices, it's the same thing. I don't think you can see where I'm pointing, but maybe this guy is texting this guy about her. Maybe this person is at work doing some sort of live broadcast. I do video conference calls on trains with the train Wi-Fi to China from the US all the time. Works just fine until you have to say something important, but that's another story. You know, cyber everything, the dark web, disconnected devices, cloud computing, everything. Well, do you really think cloud computing is stored in the clouds? Like it's stored somewhere, right? But we kind of suspend belief about where that somewhere is. Well, maybe that's kind of important if there's laws about where you have to keep your data. So, truth be told, I think that the discovery, curation, synthesis, fabrication, and delivery of data has become a lot messier and a lot more poorly understood and a lot less of what we hope it to be than reality would indicate if you really peel back the covers and look at it. So here we sit in this kind of messy world. Neil deGrasse Tyson, I love Neil deGrasse Tyson, tweeted this recently. It's a t-shirt. It says there are two types of people in this world. One, those who can extrapolate from incomplete data. If you don't like that, I took this photo recently on Long Island, and you can see here there's a bunch of seagulls, and they've all landed in a parking space. Any machine learning algorithm worth its salt would predict with a high degree of confidence that the next seagull will land in the next available parking space. It's just a ridiculous anecdotal correlation. Stuff happens, right? I saw this one too. It's a curse. I see these things, right? And I have to ask, what delivered this? It must have been a cart, right? It's just moronic things that you see, and we're surrounded by them. I'm personally troubled by this sign that says, keep this door closed at all times. Why isn't there a wall there, right? We use language in a very sloppy way. We assume relationships that aren't there. We speak in sarcasm when there's a lot more in that t-shirt than just dumb, ha, ha, ha. There's 10 kinds of people in this world, those who understand binary and those who don't, right? Those things are funny, but they're also like, there's camaraderie, right? There's sharing, there's a community building element to it. There's maybe a hidden message. He's actually trying to warn people to think more critically. So we get to, what do you have to believe? It's the Chinese symbol for believe. Does anybody here speak Chinese? It's not exactly the Chinese symbol for believe. I know, okay? There's never an exact translation, right? But I love the character. I think it's beautiful, right? What do we believe? And this is also something they teach us in the scientific method is, what are your postulates? What are your axioms? What do you hold to be absolutely true? And what are you going to assume to be true for the purposes of your analysis? Well, we forget to do that a lot in data science. We write them down in my group. It's absolutely required that before we start, we're going to write down what is important to believe for the purposes of this analysis. And we're going to go back to it later if we start challenging that, because we're going to say, no, we said that was true. We're not going to go off and chase that rat because we said that that was true for the purposes of this analysis. Now, if things change, but it's very important to write that down. I'm going to show you a couple examples of how you can fall into a trap. I mean no disrespect. I don't even know this organization. I don't know who they are. I'm going to assume that they're wonderful. I ran across this on their webpage, and it had a beautiful data visualization, so I captured it for the purposes of this observation. What I think they're trying to say, at least what I took away from it, was here's all the money we spend on planes and bombs and space shuttles and things that are either related to military or defense or related to at least government, and I don't know how space shuttles got in there actually. I think maybe they just wanted to make the number bigger, but whatever. There's defense applications for space, right? And then here's the money we spend on cancer research and all the things that we do and the number of nuclear warheads. And I'm having trouble piecing this together. And then I finally focus on this. It takes 8 days, according to these scientists, it takes 8 days for the number of people who die of terrorism to be exceeded by the number of people that die of cancer. More people die of cancer in 8 days than of terrorism. So the argument seems to be if you spent more money on cancer research and less money on bombs and planes and things, that actually you would save more people. In my humble opinion, without any further information, I see what I think to be an a priori conclusion here. We went and looked at a lot of data with the assumption that we should spend more money on cancer, which I'm not arguing whether we should or we shouldn't. There's no evidence here that spending more money on cancer will make progress on cancer. And there's also no evidence that spending less money on military won't cause more people to die. So, you know, just because you have this beautiful visualization capability and just because you can make things look beautiful doesn't abstract you from the responsibility to write down what you believe. If the visualization said, here's why we think spending more money on cancer will make progress, because here's 3 unfunded projects that look really promising and they can't get funding. And if they could somehow tie it to the funding was diverted to military, which I think would be really hard to do, but let's assume you could, and maybe you'd have my attention. Same thing on the other side. If you don't like that one, apologies in advance if anyone knows anyone that was involved with the MH370 plane that went missing. I followed it. I think I've read almost everything that's been written on this subject. And I travel a lot, so I had some personal interest, but I also had some scientific interest. These are the 7 data arcs, all of the data on Earth that anyone can collect and analyze. The analysis has the plane in 7 different circles right now. Either 6/7 of the data are being understood wrong, at least, maybe all 7, or the data's been manipulated and not too perfectly, and it's causing some sort of, what is the opposite, what is the end state of bifurcation, multifurcation, whatever that word is, right? Dispersion of the data in a way that is counterintuitive because it's either understood wrong or it's been messed with. Being Sicilian, you can guess which of the 2 scenarios I believe. We can talk about that later. But my point here is these people don't want more data. They want the grand simplifying assumption that helps them make sense out of all this. And there's very real human impact to solving this problem. And the best minds on Earth right now say it's over here, it's over there, it's in one of these 7 places. And then every once in a while, when a piece of wreckage is found on Reunion Island or someplace, we have to go back at these models and say, well, why is the ACARS data that went to the satellite differentiated? You know, there's no simple answer. A lot of times when we're looking for things that are sort of positivistic, it happened, something happened. We know for a fact that something happened. So this is not constructivist theory. This is positivistic analysis. There's an answer to be discovered here. And you see that kind of dispersion, you have to stop and say, wait a minute, stop bringing in data sets. Let's stop and revisit the fundamental assumptions here. But we don't. This is from a briefing that I did for doesn't matter who I did the briefing for. It was a government briefing. And the point I was trying to make before I got started was we don't want different things. We just use different names to want them, right? So in the government space, we're interested in data privacy, national security, cyber everything, border protection. These are government-y things to want, right? And data is being used to inform advances in those spaces. And on the industry side and to some extent in the academic side, you might see things like understanding the integrated global value chain, something we'll talk about this afternoon, or new data assets and how we incorporate them, something we'll talk about this afternoon, improving the human condition, something we'll talk about this afternoon, right? Compliance with industry standards and best practices, expressed consent, balance of trade, understanding data as it crosses borders and whether or not it may do so. Honestly, these are the same thing, but they're just being used by different names. What we want with data isn't as special as we think. We all have a tendency to think that our problems are special and our perspective is unique, and to some extent it is uniquely ours. But there's a lot of common ground here. And to the points made earlier today, if we shared some best practices around how do we make some new mistakes around building our teams and around building things that are shareable and so forth. Maybe we could connect some of those lines a little bit better. This term big data, this is one of the few places where I speak where it's okay to say big data. In many places now, you're not allowed to say big data anymore because, oh, that's so 2015. The problems haven't gone away. You know, volume, velocity, veracity, variety, value, those are all still there. And so what I try to encourage all of my counterparties to do is to fill this in for themselves. On the top row, you have some skills that you need to deal with that particular V. And in the middle row, you have some risks if you ignore that V. And on the bottom, you have some of the truths that are sort of there to be observed. And it turns out that if you go through this exercise, a big data problem is when one or more of these V's overwhelms your best attempts to deal with it. Your best attempts means not that you couldn't afford the smart enough people or you couldn't get fast enough hardware, but when you do all of that, you're still overwhelmed about it, then you have a big data problem. So talked about more data is not necessarily better, right? You're all listening to me talk right now. You see what I look like. I'm staying within the lines, so I'm on the video. There's evidence of what I look like. If there was a fire drill and we followed the instructions from Mike, the facilities guy this morning, I thought it was ironic that he was standing in front of a mic. That's how I remembered his name. He told us where to go, and he said, by the way, don't go into the active construction site when you go there, right? Like, so there was some pretty important instructions. I think we could all find each other out there. We're wearing name tags, right? I think we could all find each other, and if we wanted to continue our conversation, we could do it. What if you got out there and there was 1 million people out there? Or 2 million people? What if it was like Tiananmen Square and you're trying to find the guy in the blue shirt? The problem is that the noise in the room or the noise in the environment overwhelms the signal, and all of a sudden you can't see what you're looking for anymore. One of my colleagues referred to some of the problems that we try to solve, not like finding a needle in a haystack, but like trying to find a needle in a stack of needles. Everything looks almost the same. Needle in a haystack is easy, just burn the haystack, right? But a needle in a stack of needles is a totally different problem. The reality is that we're discarding, as a human race, way more data than we're keeping. And I've seen different estimates. The conservative estimate seems to be somewhere around 85% of data that is created is never looked at because it's unstructured or poorly understood. And within that remaining 15%, there's some argument that very little of that is actually fully exploited. It's used for one purpose and then put away. A data hub is a great idea not to do that, by the way. A good analogy would be looking at the Mona Lisa and looking at the bottom left-hand corner, the bottom 15% of the area of the Mona Lisa. The bottom left-hand corner of the Mona Lisa is a gray square. That's what we're doing in many cases with the data available to us. This kind of data that I just argued maybe shouldn't be used in some of the ways that it's being used. Well, maybe it should, right? I just think we got to work this out. Curation of data at rest versus data in motion. This is a big one. We have a huge dynamic database where I live, right? Somebody comes along almost every day and says, we would like to talk to you and some of the other data providers, and I cringe, right? If you want to insult me, call me a data provider. Because if you just take that data, which is highly dynamic, and go stick it in your database, you just killed it, right? And really, the real valuable understandings are understanding how things are changing. Well, just give it to me every month. It's changing millions of times a day. Could we have a conversation about the problem you're trying to solve? A great example, I had someone come to me and I got a note from one of our sales folks. We have an RFP, it's going out, it's due in 2 hours. There are 7 mandatory questions. We've answered 6 of them. We need you to answer the 7th one within 2 hours. And I'm thinking, well, I'm sure we didn't get this RFP 2 hours ago, but thank you very much. And the question was, how many businesses will there be in China at the end of 2019? So, I don't know. So I wrote back to the guy and I said, well, I just know that this is an insurance customer. Can you tell me something about what they're going to do with the answer? Because I've got to estimate organic growth, organic decay, our willingness to invest, political events. If you give me some idea of what they're going to do with the answer, I'll consider the elasticity of that decision against the, and the guy said, now we have 1 hour and 42 minutes. So I said, all right, if you promise to let me talk to the customer sometime next week, I'll give you an answer within less than an hour and 42 minutes. He said, done, because he doesn't care. He just wants to submit the RFP, right? So I do the best possible analysis I can. I give him a beautiful worksheet, annotated with references, which I'm sure got thrown away. And next week, I'm on the phone with the customer. And I said, I'm the guy that told you how many businesses there's going to be in China in a few years. You know I don't know that, right? He said, of course I know that. I said, well, why did you make me answer the question? He said, well, because my boss is making me answer the question. And I figured I'd make you answer the question, even though this RFP has nothing to do with China. I said, that's fair. I said, what's he going to do with the answer? And he said, sales and operations planning for ocean-going freight insurance. So I said, great. So when you want to know how many businesses there's going to be in China, you don't care about banks and restaurants and consulting firms and hotels. You care about people that make things that ship them. And he said, yep. And I said, and since it's sales and operations planning, you're going to have a different penetration rate for your customers and their family trees than for non-customers. So you really need a 4-factor analysis here. And he said, yeah, that's what I asked you for, right? I did it. I got invited to their Christmas party. All true data is not simultaneously true. Just because you collected a piece of data, for example, this circle, which was supposed to be down here, just because you collect a piece of data and it's true at the time doesn't make it universally true. We had a horrible thing happen while most of us were sleeping last night. I woke up this morning and I read that 10 people were killed. I read that 50 people were killed. I read that 60 people killed. I clicked on an article that had a headline that said 60 people were killed, and in the video they were talking about 10 people killed. What, they can't get it right? No, it's that those things were true at the time they were published, and news is sort of this real-time thing, and they're trying to bring all the information together, and they can't go back, and because it was true at the time it was written, right? So what happens to our now? What do we do with a learning algorithm? Do we take the average of those numbers? I hope not. Do we say, well, we take the highest one because they don't report a large number until they know it to be true? Well, maybe. What if the largest number was, 2 orders of magnitude larger than all the other numbers? Maybe somebody made a mistake, right? So it's not that simple. And finally, the simultaneity of truth with regard to the presence or absence of truth is something to be thought about. So sometimes people mess with the data, right? Look at the MH370 example, or any of the examples that we have with anything, cyber fraud, identity theft, all of those things. I'm sure you're well aware of all of the data breaches that are in the news. Some of them aren't really data breaches. Some of them are violations of contracts. Some of them are real cyber intrusion. And how do you understand that in a world where everything isn't simultaneously true? Why do people ask rhetorical questions, right? So everything can be oversimplified. I'm going to attempt to do that right now. There's really only 2 sets of data. There's the data you have and the data you could get. It's that simple. And the data you have, you understand its size, its character and quality. You understand some question you want to ask. You do some sort of mathy thing, usually something regressive to start with, maybe some measures of central tendency, maybe some things that have, sigmas and things in them, and you feel good, right? And then somebody says, are you done yet? And you say, well, no, I'm still analyzing. And they say, well, I need it now. You got an hour and 42 minutes. Are you done yet? No. Well, now you have an hour and 41 minutes. Are you done yet? And at some point, you get to what I call the dispositive threshold. It's a point at which you can dispose of this question. Just because you have enough data to produce an answer doesn't mean you have enough data to produce a good answer. So the most dangerous place you can be is anywhere past this dispositive threshold, because now you can give the guy the answer and he'll go away and stop beating you. But that doesn't make it right. So we have ways to estimate the impact of the best piece of data we didn't use, right? The best thing that you didn't use is the first thing that you should explain when you explain the deficiencies in your research. When I did my research, it had to do with multicultural alliances. I said, look, I didn't talk to illegal organizations. I didn't talk to drug cartels because I wanted to live, to publish this, right? But I might have learned something different had I talked to them, right? So you answer that question in advance. You say, you need to decide whether or not that would change what you're going to do with this answer, because it's not included in this study. We can triangulate. We know that about 1% of all commercial activity includes fraud. They don't tell us, well, this is fraud when they're doing it, and we certainly don't catch all the fraud. We never will. So how do I know it's 1%? Well, I look at, 3 uninformed ways of looking at that same question, and I kind of triangulate on the answer, and that's about the right answer. Then you get this data that's locked up in the vault. See, it's not really 2 pieces of data. It's really 3 universes of data. There's that data you're never going to get. You could never have gone out and gotten it. So, for example, the private tax returns of one of the 2 partners in an LLC that doesn't have to tell me anything because that's his private information, right? Maybe in the case of going to the moon, right? When the lunar lander had those giant feet on it, because they really didn't know what the squishiness was of the moon's surface, right? They didn't know if it was like powder, or if it was like rock, or if it was like fine sand. So they kind of accounted for the worst. And they made it sort of over-designed it a little bit because they didn't really understand whether it was going to tip over or not when it landed. So there's things that we can do. We have to understand the bias in our data. I love it when people talk about eliminating bias. You can never eliminate bias. You can sort of replace it with some other bias. You can account for it in your answer, but if you try to eliminate it, generally that's introducing some new kind of bias. We can borrow from economics, decision elasticity. How wrong do I need to be before the answer I'm giving would change? The action that I'm going to take. How wrong does this estimate from this squishy, changing, dynamic, heteroscedastic data, non-heteroscedastic data that I'm looking at, there's no equation for it. How wrong does my analysis have to be before the decision that you're going to take with it would be different? That's something we can do. So instead of waving our hands talking about what data we didn't use because we couldn't afford it or it wasn't available or they wouldn't give it to us, or what data we didn't use because nobody can get to it, we can just factor that into our analysis when we give it to the guy and tell him how many businesses there's going to be in China. The problem is you have to stop and think about that. And often we don't because we have machine learning and regression and all these tools and ways of measuring the fit and ways of understanding, chaos and Gini and the predictiveness and we get all caught up in the math and we stop thinking about going to the moon. So I'm just trying to encourage both. I'm not saying either is wrong. This data cloud, this word cloud, this whatever you call this thing, what do you call these things? Word cloud. I sat down one day and I sort of scribbled on a piece of paper all the words that come to mind when I think of data. And I put a number next to them of how heavy they felt on my mind at that time. So it's a couple years ago. You don't have the dark web on here. You don't have a couple of other things on here, but it's still, I think, pretty accurate. And certainly I was still thinking about big data, all those V's, volume, velocity, veracity, those were still in my mind. But you can see that permissible use, unstructured data, relationships, privacy, these are not things we normally talk about when we talk about data, and they were the heaviest. Like, I know what to do with velocity of change. I know how to deal with stream data. I know how to deal with, monotonicity. I know how to deal with, variability in the data, but I don't necessarily know how to deal with data that's unstructured that might not be permissible for me to use, and I can't understand whether or not it's permissible until I look at it, at which point I've possibly violated the law that tells me not to look at it. I don't have an answer for that. Nobody has an answer for that. So the reality is that this environment is a lot messier than we'd like to believe. This is from another briefing, and the analogy here is, I'm glad somebody laughed. Imagine trying to land. I think this is Miami International. I'm not sure. Look at all the runways, right? I'm really glad I'm not a pilot. And there's some more on the side. I don't know if you see them, but there's other runways, just because we didn't have enough, right? So as you're circling in, and somebody also pointed out that I have the plane not landing on any of the runways. Just ignore that, okay? If we start to think about where do we need to build out skill sets in our organizations as data science organizations, I believe that important places to focus, not the only important places, but certainly important places to focus, words, sentiment, and images are underrepresented. So we're doing a lot of work with numbers. We're doing a lot of work with structured data. We're doing a lot of work with visualization. not so much in words, sentiment, and images. We've kind of declared victory on sentiment, and we're way away from victory. Images, you know, there's computer vision and all that, but it's very primitive. You pretty much have to tell it what an elephant is, and then it works from there. And words, don't get me started, and certainly words when we start including other languages. So another place I think you probably want to turn the plane and think about are things, so the Internet of Things, new behaviors like cyber fraud, like, I don't want to keep saying the Internet of Things, drones and autonomous devices, and certainly new relationships, definitely important. And then as you get closer to the ground, some of the tools that you might be trying to use, AI, cognitive, bots, IoT, quantum computing, all of these things are things you might want to consider in your planning process to land this plane. How do you measure the efficacy of going down any one of those roads if you have a limited number of people, a limited amount of funding, or a limited amount of time, which is everybody in this room and everybody on Earth? Where do you send your troops? Because there's an opportunity cost. If you send them over there and you could have sent them over there and had more benefit, how do we solve this? This was a really nice tweet from the other day that I shamelessly gave credit for, so it's not so shameless, right? Machine learning doesn't mean the same thing to everybody, and yet everybody waves their arms and says, we used machine learning. Certainly supervised and unsupervised approaches, clustering, regressive methods, non-regressive methods, whether or not there's classification, and yet people will walk into a room and say, here's the results, and we use the finest machine learning methods, and you should trust this. The first thing you should do is ask them what methods. Because artificial intelligence, there's no intelligence in it, and it isn't artificial, right? The two words are both wrong, right? It's like wireless cable. Like, I don't even know what that is, right? These are from my, I just posted I have a data science blog for like non-data science people, and this one was about like, how do we know? Like, what is machine learning? What's learning from a machine text? We tend to anthropomorphize machines. They're learning, they're cognitive. No, they're not. They're algorithms. They're storing things. They're organizing things. They're drawing conclusions using algorithms and relationships. If you don't want to read the blog, this is a word cloud of the blog. So you can just look at the work. Now you read the whole thing right there. Isn't that great? So I kind of focus when I talk to business people about this change from a data perspective, without saying big data, in their place where they work, with the people they will talk to. I think these are four interesting frames. It used to be mobile, social, cloud, analytics. If you wanted to be smart, all you had to do was say mobile, social, cloud, analytics, sit down, go to the break, and you're done, right? We don't get to do that anymore. So now you can say AI, IoT, social, and workplace, right? And if you understand kind of what's in there, so in the AI space, certainly we have natural language processing. There's nothing more unnatural than natural language processing, right? When we hear that Apple bought beets, we know that a fruit did not buy a vegetable, right? And yet NLP, needs some kind of training and cues to figure that out. Ethics, is it okay? There's the can we and the should we, and those are two very different things. And in AI, this is a very big deal right now. This is a huge big deal. What happens to that drone that's a military drone that has the ability to fly a missile, and it had headwinds that were unanticipated, and it's going to run out of fuel before it gets to its target, and now it has to pick another one without a signal telling it what to do? That's pretty scary. Crash? I don't know. Glad I don't have to solve that one, right? Bots, bots are everywhere. We don't have a definition for them either, but they seem to be everywhere. There's an article that I wrote about an AI bot that goes into a bar, because it's always funny to have something walk into a bar, and it tells the bartender to shut down because it has predicted that all businesses eventually fail. Maybe it'll happen in 100 years, right? So bots are doing intrusive things, and some of them are ridiculously simple. There's this defense industry toolkit that has been leaked on WikiLeaks, and there's a bunch of 12-year-olds out there playing with it, right? There was an attack that took down about a third of the internet last year by just redirecting security cameras to, I don't want to say this isn't hard, but it's kind of not hard, right? And so if you talk to a lot of folks in the cyberspace, they say, well, we're understanding these types of attacks and we're hardening our systems to prepare for them. Well, the next attack isn't going to look like that one. So what about those same algorithms that are neuromorphic that helped you focus on your shoes, which you were not paying attention to until I just said it again? What if we build some algorithms like that? What if we learn from the failures? And by the way, if we don't, those algorithms are pretty soon going to become much more aware and start talking to each other and start learning from their failures as well as their successes, and we're going to be in deep doo-doo. The IoT we already talked about, but the only point I'll make there is the data exhaust. These devices are throwing away a tremendous amount of data after it's been used. And what happens if we don't? And, you know, in social space, I think has been well talked about, but the rights and expectations, social listening. There was an incident not too long ago with United Airlines. And I think very highly of United Airlines overall, seriously. They had the incident where the guy got dragged off the plane. The guy that got dragged off the plane that he got dragged off of wasn't a United plane. It was one of their regional carriers, but it said United on it. The people who dragged him off the plane didn't even work for that airline. They worked for the police. Oscar Munoz, the CEO of United Airlines, could have stood up and said, well, it wasn't really me, right? That would be really bad. He stood up and he owned it, right? But he said, I'm highly disappointed and apologize for the disaccommodation of the passenger in the overbooking situation. He used like language that no one understood. And so social listening immediately said, high marks for apologizing, really low marks for speaking English. And he came around pretty much the next day, and I think he got an apology consultant, and he said, here's what we did, here's how I think it impacted the public, here's how I personally impacted it, here's what I'm going to do, and here's how you'll know I did it. He followed the strict formula of an apology. There is one, by the way. And that's a great job, being an apology consultant. Like, what do you do if you're late? Like, I'm really sorry. Anyway, the problem was that in Chinese social media, there were a bunch of people saying, well, it was a Chinese guy, and United Airlines is racist. And they weren't necessarily doing the same kind of social listening in Chinese because they don't put spaces in between the words in Chinese. So it's a little harder to do some of these algorithms and cluster concepts and all of that. So it took a little longer for the news to, and it was too late. You don't get a third apology, right? In the workplace, you know, the younger demographic has figured out that there's certain ways that you can write your resume that machine algorithms that are culling for will be more likely to pick your resume. So when I look at resumes for, you know, people that are like early on in their career, as I read them as a human being, I think this is a very unimaginative resume that like could be about almost anybody else. And then I realize I'm reading it because it got through the HR people and the recruiters and all of those automatic filters because they knew how to put enough of these words in here to get this in front of me. So, you know, we've changed what a resume is. We've changed what hiring is. We've changed what expectations are in the workplace. And if you just read the news, almost every single day, you'll see some of these unanswered questions. When AlphaGo, which is a neuromorphic method, beat the best Go player in the world, there was a whole bunch of people just devastated that computers are now smarter than people. No, computers are better at playing Go than people, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean they're better at painting the next Rembrandt, or that they're better at singing opera, or that they're better at understanding how you feel in a therapy session because you read this article. There's so many things that we can still claim as uniquely human instead of just giving up this provenance to AI. But we do sometimes. The dark secret at the heart of AI, this was a great article that basically said we don't know what these methods are doing anymore. The provenance, the path by which that you came up with the 5 red things, but you don't know what you did. Sorry, you didn't go through everything you know and say, is that red? No, is that, you don't know what you did. But you know you're right. Well, the AI algorithms work like that now too. Well, how do you explain it in court when you're being deposed? And I've been in this situation where I've had to explain to an attorney, here's how, because I wrote the IP, here's how our algorithms come to that conclusion, and here's why it's a best practice. How are you going to do that when you can't explain it? Explainability is a huge issue. And sometimes governments are responding by just sort of pushing the stop button because that's the only button they have on the console right now with some of this. And that doesn't necessarily work either. I love this one. Should police have the ability to take control of driverless cars? I think when we initially think about this question, we say, well, yeah, I guess they should. What happens if terrorists can imitate police and take over the driverless car and drive it somewhere where it shouldn't go? Well, that's terrifying. They shouldn't be allowed to do that. Well, you just said they should be. It's not a yes-no question. And then there's another set of problems. We call them black cat problems. We have to deal with a lot of these problems in our space. So these are looking for fraud, looking for pretty much cyber anything. The idea behind a black cat problem is that there's a blind man, he's in a dark room, he's looking for his black cat, and he can't find it. So he asks you to come in and help him. He didn't care that the room was dark or the cat was black. You come in and try to help him, and you're confounded by those things he didn't care about. So this is looking for things that may or may not be there in places that are very hard to see. And black cat problems are really nasty. The first thing to do is to understand that you're in one, that you're dealing with one. And there are different techniques. These are some of the techniques that we use to deal with black cat problems. One of the big things that you have to realize, if it's a cat, right? The cat, when it knows you're looking for it, behaves differently. Well, bad guys do the same thing. So if you model the behavior of prior malefactors, you're modeling how you know the best ones are no longer behaving, because there's an observer effect that you change their behavior by looking for them. There's different techniques. You could make a loud noise in the room and watch the doors. Well, there's a data way of doing something similar. You could, change the behavior of, like, stack all the furniture. There's algorithmic equivalents of all the things you would do to look for that cat. But you also have to remember it may not be there. There's other types of problems that we should pay attention to. Many of you probably have come across red queen problems. This is from Through the Looking Glass, the Alice in the Tea Party. She says to the red queen, "This is the strangest place I've ever been. I'm running and running as fast as I can, and I don't seem to be getting anywhere." And the red queen says, "That's exactly the kind of place this is. You have to run as fast as you can just to stay where you are." So a red queen problem in computer science is where there's no guarantee that incremental effort will make incremental progress toward the solution. Really important to know when you're in one of those, because otherwise you start throwing resources at it, and that doesn't necessarily equal the best strategy. So you usually have to do something orthogonal to what you're doing and not stop what you're doing. Dark room problems, this is my nomenclature for something that has another name. We'll get into it offline. But the idea is, if you take all the experts on a subject and you put them in one place, and then you take all the best available literature and you put it in that one place and you lock the door, that's the best place to go to learn about that subject. But then the subject changes outside the room, and the people that are experts in the room can only learn about that change through the imperfect understanding of the people outside the room, and eventually that room becomes the worst place to go. So countries all over the world are implementing laws that say you have to keep your data here, data can't cross the borders. Those are dark room problems that they're creating. And sooner or later, people are going to say, "I'm not going to do business with you. You don't even know what's going on," versus in and out of I'm going to go do business with this country because he's pretty much the same and I can see him, right? So important to recognize dark room problems, red queen problems, all of these, black cat problems. These are all very interesting computer science challenges, and you can have an honorary PhD from name your school if you come up with a really good way of dealing with one of these, because we ain't got one right now. If we look at the regulatory space, this is kind of what's going on right now. So on one side, we have the things that they're trying to protect against, so cybersecurity, malware, disruptive innovation, and the kinds of things that the laws address. So privacy, data sovereignty, which means you must keep your data in my country because that's where I have jurisdiction to come after you if you're not supposed to have it. Anti-corruption, data protection, compliance, GDPR, the cybersecurity laws in Japan, there's laws in the United States about transparency, FATCA. There's all kinds of laws all over the world for this kind of stuff. And then on the bottom, you have the things that we kind of want: economic growth and new opportunities and innovation. And these are there's a balance here. There's a yin-yang. We can't do all of the protection because then we shut everything down. And if we just innovate, we innovate in really strange ways that sometimes people don't like. So this is kind of what's going on in the regulatory space right now. And that brings us to the future. And I'm going to show you I'm going to just fly through a number of things that we're doing in my space to show you that we're not just talking about this. We're doing research and innovation in this space. So are you. And if you're doing something that's a cousin of what we're doing, I'd love to talk. But, it's a big world out there. Maybe it would be helpful if I took the Chinese off this slide. I'm sorry, I used this recently in China and I didn't notice the Chinese there. It's just the same thing in Chinese. It would probably be helpful if we defined innovation, because we talk about innovation all the time, and it's kind of like talking about the Internet of Things or machine learning. We don't all mean the same thing. So I've taken a stab with my group at saying if we're going to call it innovation, we've got to label what kind of innovation it is. And basically, if you take all the permutations of things and ways, so doing new things in old ways, doing old things in new ways, doing new things in new ways, you get the corners of this space. So an example of doing an old thing in a new way might be using the sensor data on a fitness monitor to detect tremors in the arm. Maybe the old way was some sort of, what do they call it, NMG, something like that, where they put the electrodes and so, one is very sort of, you're not aware of it, the other one you are, there's benefits, right? Maybe an example of doing a new thing in a new way would be something like the exoplanet research that's going on right now, which is just amazing. Maybe doing an old thing, doing a new thing in an old way would be the way that we collect data through interviews, right? We still interview people for certain types of human-centric input. And we still have the problem of the convenience sample, that we don't know what the people who didn't respond might have said. But now we have ways of watching the behavior of the non-respondents as they're not responding, and that can become input to the process, and it's still ethical to do that. So maybe that's interesting. We also should recognize that innovation sometimes is just new ways of knowing, realizing that we have problems we didn't know, or taking large problems and breaking them down into smaller problems that are still unsolved. Those are all valid forms of innovation. As long as you name it, it's kind of like playing pool. You got to call your shot. You can't just do something and then later try and call it innovation. I'll call you on that, at least not where I come from. My biggest advice is keep digging. Some of these problems are just enormous, ginormous, right? Cybersecurity, I don't know where this is going. I can guarantee you what will happen if we stop working on it, though. The bad guys won't. So we got to keep focused on some of these. This is some examples of personics. We do a lot of work in personics, understanding people in the context of business. These are the three big problems that you have. The John Smith problem, that people have, more than one person has the same name. The Sybil problem is one person that goes by more than one name. And then you have the Ann Taylor problem, where businesses are named after people that may or may not be people. There's no person named Ann Taylor, but there are people named Ann Taylor that are not that Ann Taylor. And there you go, right? There's a woman named DorothyCom.com. She gets all kinds of weird email. So basically the way we solve a problem like this is we collect permissibly a bunch of indicia about people in the context of business. And then according to a set of rules for the particular use case, whether it's marketing or sales or cyber or fraud, we have certain clustering rules. And we allow this data to coalesce according to those rules. And this is very heterogeneous data. So these clustering rules there's learning methods involved in them. And eventually we build these points. And when we get enough of these points that we've coalesced to a persona for that particular use case, then we call that a unique person. And then we start agglomerating other data to the behavior of that person. And then we create like a flock of birds. If you look at a flock of birds from a distance, it looks like one thing. And then as you get closer, you realize it's a bunch of birds. We use clustering algorithms, flocking and swarming algorithms, to build flocks of clusters of personics. We used to call this cluster flocking, but that was unfortunate. So now we call it hyperclusters. And these hyperclusters have data attached, so we can say one of the John Smiths went to jail, we don't know which one, here you go, that kind of thing. Eventually you get, so this is progressive decomposition, and eventually you get to, this is our ontology for doing this. So you have a business, and the business could talk about itself, or the business could talk about a person. You could have another person that's not part of that business, another business that's not part of that business, and then you get all the vectors in between. We try to take all the articulations and put them into one of those vectors, and we move along. So that's essentially what we do. And then you get to my favorite word in the English language, flossing, nossing, heliopilification, which is assessing things. Let's all say it together. Flossing, nossing, no takers. All right. The idea is some language just doesn't mean anything. It's worthless. Throw it away. But how do you figure out what doesn't matter? And how do you figure out what does? There are these confounding characteristics of language. These are the ones we're looking at. Sarcasm, neologism, grammar variation, punctuations, intrusion of foreign language, and intentional misspellings. Those are not a list of approximately 5. Those are the ones we're looking at. So we've done a lot of work to come to that list. And we've got all kinds of algorithms and methods for dealing with that. Here's some examples of those things happening. Lyft is said to hire catalysts as Uber's rival explores deals. Imagine you're an algorithm trying to figure out where the proper nouns are there. welcome to one of the circles of linguistic hell, right? This is not an easy thing to do, and it's changing as we're using language, and not just in English, by the way. If we get it right, and we can put all of those articulations into an ontology like this, we can start to ask some very important questions, like, are the leaders leading their organization or following the crowd? Are there different modes within an articulating group of individuals? When I say individuals, people in the context of business. We don't focus on people at all. When a business speaks, is it speaking differently to its shareholders than it speaks to its employees or to its customers? These questions start to become answerable in an empirical way. If we did it again, we would get the same conclusion, and we can look at millions or billions of articulations and cluster them this way, and this starts to get really powerful. Are we done yet? Absolutely not. But are we on this journey? Absolutely. So really exciting stuff. It gets really ugly when you start including other languages and other writing systems. This is just an example of Kawasaki. You know, in Japanese, you have 4 different writing systems. One of them is ideogrammatic, like Chinese. They don't put spaces in between the words. In Korea, where Kawasaki also operates, it's actually phonetic. Even though it looks like Chinese, it doesn't really look like Chinese at all, and it sounds, but they came from original Chinese cognates. So when we try to use sound, meaning, and geolocation to center on identity, it's a massively non-trivial problem. We have a lot of IP in this space. But there's a certain reality check. We've got to stop. Are we ever going to solve FBI hunting for San Francisco man with explosives? It's a dangling modifier. Like the FBI isn't going around blowing things up trying to find the San Francisco man, right? It's bad grammar, right? The Vatican is sometimes referred to as the Holy See, and there was a blind bishop appointed to the Vatican as a cardinal, so that it said blind bishop appointed to see. See is not a verb there, it's a noun. Thank you. One person in the room thinks that's funny. I think it's funny. Sometimes people start speaking other language. He had a certain je ne sais quoi. Am I speaking English or French, right? Here's all the 127 different ways to spell Gaddafi because they don't write the vowels in Arabic. Please shoot me now, right? And then this famous imposter who was charged with being an imposter, right? We're not going to solve all of these problems with algorithms, right? So we just basically have to be realistic that we're going to solve most of them and we're going to be mostly correct. It's much better to be consistently wrong than to be inconsistently right. If we can get this thing stable and we can measure how good it is, the elasticity of the decisions we're making, that's a good day. This is from one of my briefings. It's just basically watch this space. These are some things that I think if you're interested in language, you should pay attention to. I'll just pick a couple. The changing behavior of people to obviate graphemic analysis. What does that mean? It means that sometimes terrorists write in trending social media topics about the Super Bowl, and they're really talking about a terrorist attack. Whoops. Using language to hide language, that's the same thing in a different way. Inter and intra-language correlation, an example of that would be the Kawasaki thing that I just showed you. This is maybe a little closer to home for some of you. We take everything, so we have about 10 to the 8th entities, and we have about 10 to the 3rd attributes that can define dyadic relationships. So we connect everything to everything, and every way everything connects to anything, and we get a dyadic multihedron with about 10 to the 24th edges. You can't walk through that thing with a deterministic algorithm. You've got to use all sorts of methods. So we launch these algorithmic agents in and we give them different instructions. And one of the things we do is we find the lumpy parts. And then those lumpy parts, we zoom in on them and we use other methods for that. On the right, you see what we call ink blots, which are geofencing is often done by putting a circle in the middle of an area of interest and a point, and then drawing a circle around that and making the radius of the circle inversely proportional to some logarithmic function, and you feel good because it's logarithmic, right? But the reality is you're drawing circles around water, or you're drawing circles around places where nobody lives because there's a desert there, or you're drawing circles around places where nothing happened because it's against the law to do that thing, right? So it turns out that if you use those attributes that are discoverable about the behavior that's producing the dyadic relationships and use that to form the shape for your geofence, you get a much better answer. I'm in the home stretch here. Rhombohedral distortion. Yeah, that's a thing, right? You were talking about it indirectly. I think somebody was talking about this morning, but Yeah, you were. Thank you. I'm sorry. I pointed rhombohedrally. The issue here is that when you have long, thin things that are oriented north-south, and thank you, and you try to put a square around the circle, that square is distorted, and especially when you extrapolate an address into a latitude and a longitude, for example, there's a lot of error involved in doing that. It turns out if you take a city block and you put it at the equator and you bring it up to the North Pole, you change the area of that rhombus by about 12%. Whoops. So in these places like Japan or Florida, if we don't factor in rhombohedral distortion and we're doing something that kind of precision would matter, like looking at events that happened and how close they were to people, businesses that we know about, that starts to become problematic. So the point isn't do you do this or not do this. The point is do you test whether or not it matters? And that's what's important. This is just some examples of, in this case, we were looking for anomalous behavior in websites. These are fake pharmaceuticals. And by using sort of standard methods of understanding what a likely bad looks like, you will do work like this all the time, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. But it turns out if you start differentiating the data, lots of it, in multiple axes, you start to see different observations. So the one aha here is to sort of rotate what you focus on and not just focus on the thing that seems to be the primary driver of the correlative relationship because it's a multi-factor relationship. And with something like bad behavior, which this is, those bad guys are changing their behavior as they're shutting down websites and things, right? So we're finding the mother websites, essentially. This is just more of that, but now associating actions and methodology into the data as well. So this is where like the secret sauce comes in. This is all math, ranking and multivariate clouds and scaling and so forth. And then this is like using some sort of secret sauce. Like we know, for example, that bad guys, when they lie, they come and look at the data where they lied about themselves to make sure it's there before they go and do something, right? Well, we know that. We're not idiots, right? So we can factor that in. This is an ostrich getting ready to put his head in the sand because here comes quantum computing, which is going to change almost everything. I'm not going to say quantum computing will be applicable. Clearly, I'm not going to say it because I can't say it, to everything, right? But there's certain types of problems, especially those involving decay, that this is going to become very important, and value chain analysis is a great example of that. So imagine doing that with a quantum algorithm. Here's doing something traditionally in cyber. We're basically, different ways of looking for relationships pairwise. This is Kendall's tau. This is some sort of regressive analysis. And then all of a sudden, with quantum computing, we can connect everything to everything. We've got these little buckets of infinity, right? A qubit is anything between 0 and 1, not 0 or 1. So the number of interactions grows, I don't know what the word is, beyond hypergeometrically, hypergeometrically, really big. And it allows us to do, with a degree of simultaneity, things that would probably take thousands of years to do the old-fashioned way. This is just using that same technique for hacking, decryption, right? Turns out that quantum hacking is terrifying. Terrifying if we don't build quantum resistance into encryption. Encryption can become somewhat irrelevant. This is the last example I have for you. When the big earthquake and tsunami and radiation incident happened in Japan, a bunch of us were working on that dyadic multihedron thing, and I pushed the stop button. I said, other than donating money, we've got to be able to do something here. 20,000 people were washed out to sea, and then the really bad things started to happen. Just horrific. We started to look at our data because we want to help the businesses that survived. A lot of them are small mom and pop businesses, right? If they lose a week or a month's worth of business because everybody assumes they're not there anymore, now we add starvation to all of these other horrible problems. So we started to look at the geospatial, we used rhombohedral distortion and all that stuff, and we built out, we looked at satellite imagery, we found previously unbroken straight and curved lines. We did regression analysis of the shape of the skyline and compared it to the mass of a missing building. We took the flood zone and we figured out what was above and below and inside and outside the flood waters. We built the tectonic algorithms for how shook up they got based on the epicenter of the earthquake, 19 different car detection algorithms to figure out if the cars in the parking lot were done. It was going to take over 2 years to fix the data the old-fashioned way, start to finish, built, done, tested, implemented, took 3 months. And when we were done, we put the data on the internet and gave it away for free. So I think we can matter, all of us can matter, when these noble causes come around, but you got to stop listening to the people that are talking about ROI sometimes, not all the time. A little bit of a summary of some of the things I talked about in terms of behaviors that you might want to pay attention to, like observer effects and rushing to market. And finally, I'm going to hit the black button. This is a model from one of my briefings, just talking about all the different roles that we have to have as a data scientist. I think you'll talk about a lot of this afternoon, but this was my attempt to list some of the roles we often get forced into playing, and maybe we're qualified and maybe we're not for all of these, and sort of a continuum that I consider in terms of how advanced is an organization in their adoption and use of data. And now, finally, I'm going to leave you with two quotes that inspire me. These aren't random quotes that came off the internet. I did get them off the internet, but a long time ago. Albert Einstein said that we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. And he also said that everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. So my challenge to all of you really smart people is my philosophy, for what it's worth, I'm going to share it with you. Teach something and learn something every day. If all you're doing is teaching, you're becoming slowly irrelevant because that world is changing awfully fast. And if all you're doing is learning, you're being selfish. Thank you very much for paying attention.
Thank you. We will take a few minutes before we break for lunch for some questions.
Dan Linzell, University of Nebraska. I'm an engineer, so bear with me. You talked a lot about coming at it from your side of the street, from this side of the street, and I think your last slide where you listed kind of the stream of consciousness, the way things progress, you alluded to, before those. Yeah, so you talked about storyteller diplomat, and that's something that I don't consider myself a data scientist. I don't know if my colleagues do or not, but I'm always concerned about the end users and their. It seems to me that we have this bifurcation, I'll use that word, where there's this assumption that all the data is good and right, but a fear that there's too much data, and I'm just going to turn off the switch. Yeah. And I'm just interested in your opinion about that, whether I'm right or wrong, I don't know. But how do we overcome that? I'm especially concerned about the latter statement, which is you're talking about quantum, data manipulation, computing, all that good stuff. I assume that's what it means. And so how do we become the storyteller? We tell the right stories. How do we become the diplomats to not have the ostrich bury its head further into the sand?
I thank you for the question. It's an awesome question. A lot of these conversations at the senior level start with, why don't we just, right? Well, we got this data, why don't we just stop right here? Don't talk about quantum computing. Do we have one now? Can you buy one? Well, there's only one on Earth. Well, there may be two, depending. Whatever, I don't care. Well, you should care, right? But if I tell you what you should do, depending on your personality, you may shut down even further and dig your heels in even further. So this gets into sort of advocacy of how do you get, as an engineer, there's lots of jokes about the difference between engineering and marketing and sales, right? So, what you can do and what you should do, and very often arguing for something that is possible because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it, right? So I think the very first step there, without being trite, is just the awareness of that you need to get advice. And then understanding that advocacy, you need somebody in the organization that can be a translator, that has skills on both sides of the organization. So a lot of what I do in my role is I talk to the people. I used to lead the data development. I used to be a developer. I spent many years in IT, so I speak that language. Don't ask me to write a program today. That's a different story. But I can speak that language and I can pay those people, right? And then I come over here and I can understand the language of the shareholder and the language of the value proposition to the customers. You need to have somebody that's in that role. And I don't care what you call them. I don't care if you call them a data scientist or if you call them a evangelist, or there's all kinds of crazy words, but they can't fake understanding what's really going on with the data and the technology. They can't just wave their hands over there. And at the same time, they can't come over here and just talk about let me tell you again how important it is. and how correct this analysis is, because that doesn't work either. They need to understand advocacy, and that's a totally different skill.
Where does empowerment fit in? Because in my field, I see people that are afraid to admit that they don't know what the hell's going on.
Yep, I make, I haven't made my monthly mistake yet, but I make at least one a month. My boss is the CEO. And the reason is because I'm not part of any line of business. I'm part of every line of business. And that's done very intentionally. I may not be able to go in and push the start button because that involves funding, but I can sure help push that stop button if something shouldn't be happening, right? And I've got that sort of mandate, or whatever you want to call it, referential authority, and hopefully I have it through understanding and not just title, right? So I think that, empowerment, there's different kinds of empowerment. There's, I'm going to give you a badge, the Wizard of Oz, you've got courage. I had courage all along, right? Part of empowerment is, are you empowering somebody who has that power, right? Like, are you giving them power, or are you just sort of naming that power? And then part of empowerment is, how are they going to use it? If they go around and, I'm really important. If they go around and talk to everybody, well, that's wrong, right? So, I start a lot of conversations with help me understand. If I think that somebody is dead wrong, I don't say you're dead wrong, because they probably can't hear anything else I say at that point. But I might say, well, help me understand how this is going to work, and I'll point out what I seem to. There's a million ways that this can happen, but really what it all boils down to is, don't be a jerk, and know what you don't know. Because it's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's when you don't know what you don't know.
So again, relating to this slide, what are the skills we should be teaching our students now so they can get a job? Because some of these are specific technical skills, and we're aware of that.
Yeah.
But some of them are more sort of broad-based, future-proofed things that we should be teaching everybody, regardless of their specialization.
Amen. I do a lot of work with universities that are building data science programs or trying to enforce their data science programs, analytics. And the big question is, what do we teach today that's going to be relevant in 3 years, right? And boy, with the pace of change, what I start with, and call me wrong, but if you show me your program and I see Python and R and I see a whole bunch of tools, Tableau, I don't want to start naming things because I'm not against any of those things, right? That's not data science. Those are tools. That's like saying, I'm going to teach you to be a master carpenter, and we have a course on the hammer and the wrench and the screwdriver. You will need to learn to use those things, but that's incidental to the learning. I want to see something in there around problem formulation. I want to see something in there on methodology. I want to see something in there on storytelling, on visualization, not using visualization tools, but creating effective visualization. I want to see something in there on regulatory, understanding what data can and may be used. I want to see something in there on understanding some of these squishier things like decision elasticity and dispositive thresholds. Now, I realize that can't be all of the program, but if that's none of the program, then it's a vocational school kind of thing. Is that fair? Really important vocation, but not enough.
Okay. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you very much.
Standing between you and lunch, I really appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.